Pleasure to present Dr. Robert Seamans. Please proceed, Dr. Seamans.
Well, I'm very happy to have this chance to sit here and chat with you and your wife. And going back to the beginning, when I first became aware of things like math and physics and so on, I was at a small school in Lenox, Massachusetts. It was a Episcopal school. The headmaster was a minister, but he was also very interested in science and technology, which was sort of an amazing combination. And he encouraged several of us who, in high school, showed an interest in math and physics. He carried us perhaps somewhat further than normally go in high school.
Just perhaps to orient ourselves as a period of time, what were the years that you spent, say, in high school and grade school?
Well, I started high school in 33, graduated from high school in 1936.
Oh, yes.
And I had very little in the way of concept of what I might want to eventually do. I thought of going to the University of Wisconsin, I think partly because I would be sort of further away from home than most of my relatives had been. So when it finally came down to the wire, I did check in at Harvard, and I was accepted at Harvard, where my father had been and my uncle had gone, and so on. When I started in college, I took the normal courses, and I went out and tried to play football and hockey and baseball. I wasn't terribly good at it. I got beaten up in the line of scrimmage quite a few times. But I did find that there were some courses that I liked a lot better than others at Harvard. And these courses, again, were in mathematics and physics. And there was then at Harvard an undergraduate program called Engineering Sciences. I found that by getting involved in that particular line of endeavor, I didn't have to take what were called divisional examinations. I didn't have to have a tutor. It was a little bit less disciplined than some of the other series of courses.
Do you remember any of your college professors at that time?
Yes, Professor Hartline was he was a civil engineer, and he's also a classmate of my father's. And I first got to know him between freshman and sophomore year. I decided there was no point hanging around all summer, so I went up to the Harvard surveying camp at Squam Lake and learned how to level up a transit and go out there and tape through the underbrush and make maps and contour lines and put in railroads on paper and all that sort of thing. And I found I really enjoyed it.
Oh, yes, the usual engineering, starting engineering curriculum.
Exactly what it was. And then I found that by a fluke, at the end of the summer, I had the equivalent of a year and a half's work at Harvard. There was a required English course for all freshmen unless you got over a certain grade at Harvard in your college boards. And I got over that grade, even though I wasn't supposed to be very good in English. I had a cousin exactly my age who was terribly good in English, and he had to take the required course, and I didn't. And the family were absolutely positive that the exams got crossed up when they were graded. But
that's a very amusing incident.
Yeah. But in any event, I decided to try to go through college in 3 years, and I did. I actually graduated in 1939 as of the class of 1940. And I guess I was lucky that it worked out that way because partway through my junior year, which was my last year of studies, I developed a shortness of breath and I found I couldn't exercise and so on, and it turned out I had rheumatic fever.
Oh my!
So what would have been normally my senior year in college, I was in bed for 3 months. and was then allowed to get out of bed for 5 minutes the first day and 10 the second, and so on, until the summer after I would have graduated, this was 1940, I was back living a pretty normal existence. But I felt that 3 months in bed and then another 6 months to really get reconstituted, although I wouldn't wish it on anybody, it was really a very valuable experience, and I had a chance to think a great deal about what I wanted to do. And I also had the benefit of a very large number of people who were very thoughtful, who came in to see me, and for a one-on-one conversation with people, and I thought I got to know a lot of people much better than you do in sort of casual conversation as you pass somebody on the street or at a large party or something of that sort.
Oh, yes. Well, that's wonderful to have that opportunity. I suppose you also had an opportunity to do quite a bit of reading in your favorite
I did a lot of reading, and as a result of that, I thought possibly rather than sort of follow the engineering line, maybe some form of medicine would be might be more challenging and so on. And so the summer after I was back on my feet, I went back to Harvard. I had my degree, but I went back there and took pre-med courses that summer. And at that point, I became rather uncertain as to what I might do. I found that I wasn't particularly enamored of cutting into animals and various things, and some of the engineering I'd done seemed a little more attractive. You asked me what faculty there were at Harvard at that time. Den Hartog, who eventually went to MIT, was then teaching mechanical engineering, and he was a most stimulating person at Harvard. And then a fellow named William Bollet taught aerodynamics, and I, as a junior, helped calibrate a wind tunnel that he was building there in the musty old building that we use for engineering. And so when I weighed it all, as I sort of drove into Cambridge, still uncertain as to exactly which way I ought to go, I decided that the engineering made more sense. And so I actually enrolled at Harvard in the graduate school of engineering. And after the second day, a friend of mine said, I'm not certain that we're getting the best possible education here at Harvard in engineering. He said, we might do better if we were doing graduate work at MIT. And he said, I'm going over there this afternoon, and would you care to come along with me? And I didn't know anything about MIT really at that time, but I said, sure, I'd be glad to go with him and keep him company. And the first place we went was logically the admissions office, and Dean Thresher had a few moments to spare, and my friend explained what he had in mind, and Dean Thresher was very thoughtful, asked me what I'd done in college, although I wasn't really interested in transferring, but I told him. And he said, well, you two boys apparently have done quite good work at Harvard, and you've taken courses that will give you some credit here at MIT, and I think we can start you both off here as sophomores. And at that point, we both stood up and thanked him very much and headed for the door, not at all interested in going back and being undergraduates again, when he said, he said, possibly you can get more credits if you go around to each department at MIT. If you filled out this form here, which will show what courses you took at Harvard and what the textbooks were and the subject matter and so on. Just go around to each department and see what credits they will give you here at MIT in equivalent courses. Well, my friend was absolutely disgusted by this when we got out in the corridor and said he was going back to Harvard. And I can't tell you why, but I was just intrigued with the thought of listing all the courses I'd taken, not only as an undergraduate, but also in high school, and then going around and bargaining with everybody at MIT in these various departments, and I was doing quite well. I found that pretty soon I was up to the junior year and maybe even the senior year, and I ended up in aeronautical engineering with a person named R.H. Smith. Dr. Hunsaker was then the head of the department, but this was in 1940, and he was already very busy in Washington. He'd been in the Navy, and he also was involved with the NACA, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. R.H. Smith was the sort of acting head of the department. He said, I just can't understand why you want to come over here and be an undergraduate when you have your bachelor's degree. And I said, well, of course I don't want to do that. But Dean Thresher said that I didn't have enough credit to come to MIT as a graduate student. And he said, well, that's ridiculous. He looked at what I'd done, and he said, I'll call him right now. And they had quite an argument over the phone. And I could tell what the conversation, how it was going, and I was able to interject a few things. I had this and that and the other thing that Thresher said I hadn't had. And so then R.H. Smith said, well, it's settled. You come over here now as a graduate student in aeronautical engineering.
You made a lot of progress from being a sophomore undergraduate to a graduate student.
This is in 48 hours. And I thought it was great fun. And so, but then he turned to me and he said, now, do you know how long it's going to take you to get a Master of Science degree in aeronautical engineering? And I said, well, I really don't. He said, well, you do have a fair number of deficiencies in aeronautical engineering. He said, I think it'll probably take you about 3 years. And I said, well, that's quite a while, isn't it? And he said, unless you want to concentrate in instrumentation. And I said, well, how long would that take? And he said, well, I don't really know. And I said, and what is it? And he said, I'm not exactly sure. But he said, there's a Dr. Draper who's responsible for instrumentation here, and why don't you go around and see him? And he can tell you about it.
That's a fabulous story to be able to get connected up with Dr. Draper in that way. So
I went around to see Dr. Draper, and he said, well, the best way for you to find out is to take my course, and it's starting next Monday, and see what you make of it. And I said, how long will it take? And he said, to get a degree. And he said, well, that's going to be up to you. But he said, I don't think it'll take 3 years if you really get going and work hard and take a reasonable number of courses each term. So the next Monday, I was there, all registered at MIT, and much to the amazement of my parents, who I think thought maybe I was doing something a little bit peculiar to resign from Harvard and go to MIT. But
very unorthodox behavior, to say the least.
Yes, and so I went in this classroom in Building 33 there, the Guggenheim Laboratory, so-called, and I noticed that Dr. Draper didn't have on a coat, and he had on a green eye shade, and the classroom was just absolutely full of students, people standing up in the back of the room, and he came in, he said, now I know there's some of you that don't really know exactly what you want to do, and you're not sure whether you want to be engineers or not. He said, I'll tell you, if you want to be engineers, don't expect to be able to buy a lot of horses or to buy mink coats for your wives or that sort of thing. But he said, I'll guarantee you'll have a lot of fun. And that was sort of the spirit of the course. It was a lot of fun. And I did stay working with him actually for 15 years.
Yeah. Well, I didn't realize that because Dr. Draper is known for his tremendous research contributions. I had no idea he was such an outstanding teacher also.
And, well, he was a remarkable teacher because he involved us really in the work he was doing. I mean, he'd come into the classroom and actually discuss the kind of thing he'd been doing over the weekend, and the examples that we had to work on for the course were not examples, were not questions or problems that had been handed out over the years. They were new problems that were brand new and right up to date, and that's what made it exciting. And certainly everybody who took his courses were stimulated by him and the people he'd gathered around him, Walter McKay and some of the other faculty there. So it turned out that by 2 semesters later, that is by I guess it was July of the following, this is 1941, I'd finished all the coursework that I needed for my master's degree and only required the thesis. to get the Master of Science degree. And so I went around to see Doc, as he was called by everybody, students included, and said, "Doc, I need a thesis to get my degree. You got any suggestions?" And he said, we have a program with the Sperry Gyroscope Company to make some vibration measuring equipment. And if you'd care to work on some aspect of that," he said, "I think we could pay you a stipend as you work on your thesis." And I thought, my goodness, imagine getting paid to go to college. And I said, that would be great. And so I started in August of the summer of 41. My boss was an instructor by the name of Oldfield, nicknamed Barney for the old racetrack driver. And I was a research assistant. And it wasn't very long after that Barney Oldfield, it turns out, was in the Army Reserve, and he was called to active duty. And Doc Draper called me into his office and asked me if I'd like to be an instructor that fall. And I said, well, that would be just fine. And I was a little apprehensive about being an instructor, but I figured nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Being an instructor at MIT is a sort of a formidable undertaking.
Yeah. And that turned out to be a very, very valuable experience. I was able, all during the war, I was there at MIT working in part as an instructor, and then 3 years after that becoming an assistant professor. And I was also doing research in the instrumentation lab with Doc Draper, in part on conventional aircraft instruments, and in part on fire control for the Navy, anti-aircraft fire control, as well as fire control for the Air Force, for gun firing equipment for fighters, and as well as a bomb sight. So I ended up, working with a 7-day-a-week proposition there. I had there were Navy students coming through I guess it was the V-12 program, and they would come in as, I think, lieutenants, and they would be at MIT for 3 months. They were split into 2 groups, and each group took a course in instrumentation for 6 weeks. And then the other group would come in for 6. I taught that course, I think, 14 times, and there was never a gap other than a weekend between each group, just going right around the clock. And of course, at the very beginning, there were many of the Navy coming through there that were considerably older than I was, and with some of them coming from the well-known instrument companies. And it wasn't long before they figured out that they knew more than I did. So they'd try to bait me, and I found that a pretty good technique in dealing with them. I'd find out who they were, where they were from, and then I'd say to the class that we're very fortunate to have John Smith from the Bendix Corporation, and I'd invite them to give one of the lectures. And I found that usually shut them up pretty rapidly. They didn't like the idea of having to come front and center and do any work.
Yes, that was a very, very good technique there.
Yeah. That was the sort of the war experience. I remember that on the 24th of December, Doc coming in and saying, "I don't think we need to come in and work tomorrow," being Christmas Day. But it was an amazingly intense period of time with both the academic side of it as well as the research and development side, tied in with primarily the Navy and the Air Force.
Yes, of course, MIT had so many important active programs in the defense effort there, so there must have been a real hotbed of activity in all the fields there at MIT.
Yeah, of course, the radiation lab was there
yes.
Which Lee DuBridge was the director of and ran so effectively, and Gordon Brown in electrical engineering had the servo mechanism lab, and when the war was over, there was a question of what to do and so on, and in the research side of things, we realized that one of the problems that we had with the fire control with aircraft was the airplane itself, that the computers and the sights and so on were better than or more capable of coming up with the right answer than the pilot was in flying the airplane. And so we suggested to the Air Force that there should be a project where we would actually measure the performance of an airplane in flight and then run some tests with fire control equipment to see wherein the largest errors occur. Did they occur in the inertia of the airplane, or the control surfaces of the airplane, or the pilot's inability to follow the information from the sight, or was it actually in the computer itself? And so this was called the Tracking Control Project. And this was the first project that I established. I figured out that this would be a good thing to do and got the project sold and got it funded, and I ran it for about 3 years' time. It's a very exciting project. I might just interject one thing, though, before going back, thinking of the war. One of the projects that we had was for automatic gun laying for a director system that was going to be used to shoot down kamikazes. And this meant that we had to track with radar, because the kamikazes were all coming in with the sun behind them, so you couldn't look up and see the plane coming in. You had to track it with radar. Then you had to have the sight and so on. And the problem, the equipment was built, and then it was found it was very difficult to acquire the target in the first place. And Doc Draper came up with the idea of how this could be done and gave me the job of rounding up the equipment and taking it down. And the first installation was on a ship called the Bonhomme Richard, which was one of our aircraft carriers, one of the larger ones. And so with great zeal, I got the servo drives and the various things that are going to be required for the target acquisition system, and put it in the back of a Hertz car and drove down to Bayonne, New Jersey with it, where the ship was tied up. And it took me about 24 hours to get through the gate. And then when I got to the ship, they wouldn't allow me on the ship. And when I finally got on the ship, the gunnery officer said nobody but nobody was going to touch any of the equipment on that ship. So, certainly I could see not somebody, a very young man from MIT, because they had all the green chits, you see, where everything was tagged and ready to go to sea.
Few obstacles in your way there.
Yeah. So I got hold of Doc Draper on a pay phone while standing out on the dock, and he in turn called somebody in Washington, and later on the day, Admiral Martel from the Bureau of Ordnance arrived and explained to the gunnery officer this equipment was going on the ship. But by the time I started to work on it, the ship was about to sail. So a lot of the work there were 3 of these installations to make, were while we went out for the ship's first trials at sea. This is in the middle of winter, out of Bayonne, New Jersey, and they found a place where I could sleep, which happened to be right by the place where the elevators go up and down all night long with all the airplanes on them. And I found that I had to tie into one cable that was down on the keel of the ship, and another set of cables are up in the skipper's sea quarters up on top of the bridge, and I was tearing around with these wiring diagrams trying to figure out where all these wires were so I could interconnect them. And I also found that there were Western Electric people on board who had responsibility for the radar, and in a few cases I'd make some connections, I had to their equipment. But when I come back 2 hours later, I found they disconnected the wiring I'd already put in there because they didn't like anybody meddling with their equipment. Well, anyway, after about a week, the equipment seemed to be working, and they actually had trials at sea where the plane came over towing a target, and they fired away, and everything seemed to work all right. So I was put ashore off the coast of Norfolk. I had to go down the side of the ship with a rope ladder, holding my oscilloscope that I'd taken out of the laboratory at MIT, and jumped into a launch and took me ashore. And there was a message for me to call Dr. Draper as soon as I arrived ashore. And his deep concern was that I'd taken an Avis car, and the Avis company was very distraught that they couldn't find me or the car, and where were the keys to the car so they could send the driver down to take it back to Boston. But he was very pleased the equipment worked, and I had to win my way back to Boston by train, going through Richmond and sitting between cars on bags and so on. All the trains were so terribly crowded. And arrived back in Boston with the word that the next morning I was to go out on a destroyer to put similar equipment aboard this destroyer. But it was very gratifying in that these ships, soon after they got this equipment, were out in the Pacific and were able to shoot down some of the kamikazes at least. And
yes, I believe that that equipment plus the development of the proximity fuse and a few other things that really almost turned the tide, I believe, in aircraft defense.
But that had a very small role in all of that. But coming back to the tracking control project, here was a project where for the first time I'd sort of conceived of something that I thought needed to be done, and was able to assemble a team that turned out to be about 35 people we had working. And one of the aspects of the project was that in those days it was multidisciplinary. The term is used a great deal today to include everything from environmental engineering to social science. But in those days, you found that very seldom you even had a project where electronic engineers and aeronautical engineers worked together. And we had to do that in this project. We had to try to simulate how the airplane might respond, and there weren't simulators then. We actually built an analog computer as part of the project, so we could try to anticipate how the airplane would respond. We had to test the airplane, found that there just wasn't data available that would tell us how an airplane responded to the controls dynamically. I found that there was work going on at the Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory in Buffalo where they were actually oscillating the controls and measuring the response of the airplane. And so we installed equipment on an A-26 aircraft so that we could oscillate first the elevator and then the rudder and then the ailerons and at different speeds and so on, and see what happened. It was a pretty laborious process, needless to say, and so then we experimented with more of a pulse, where you'd have two stops on the control column and just have the pilot, as fast as he could, just do this and do that and measure the response. And it turned out you could get the same data that way, and you didn't have to do didn't take as long to get the information. We did the same kind of thing with the autopilot, put in dynamic signals and measured the response, and with the radar, and so that when we were with our computer able to simulate it, and it seemed to be stable, then very cautiously we started tying the whole system together and flying it, and those were really exciting days.
Yes, well, it was, of course, just a year before, pilots flew by the seat of their pants, so to speak, and then you're getting into the controls, which increased the effectiveness fantastically.
And this was work that we did with Wright Field, and there was a colonel in charge of the armament lab out there named Lee Davis. He became a general in the Air Force, but he was overall was responsible for this project along with a lot of other projects. And this was at the same time that the first jet bombers were being built out at the Boeing company. And they found when they first flew this is the B-47, that if the pilot wasn't careful, all of a sudden the airplane would go into quite a violent oscillation this way, lateral oscillation. and they decided that the thing to do was to put a servo mechanism in there that would drive the rudder that would cause the airplane to fly straight. But they weren't allowed to connect it without Air Force approval. This is a very wild thought in those days, that you might not have the pilot do the whole job, you see. And so I got a call from Colonel Davis, and he said he was going out to Seattle, and he'd like me to join him out there to review the possibility of putting in these dynamic controls into this B-47. And we arrived out there and met with the Boeing people, and they said that they wanted to connect the servo, and General Davis said, well, where is the information on the airplane as to how it's going to respond dynamically, the same kind of data we'd been getting on our airplane. And they said, well, they didn't have it right there with them. And he said, well, where is it? And they said, well, it's over in another building, another part of Seattle. And he said, well, go and get it. And they said, well, it'll take quite a while. And he said, well, we'll sit here and we'll wait. You just go get it. Well, it turned out they didn't have the data. And so the decision that we made wasn't very astute. We said, why didn't they try it, but turn it on very gradually? So if anything catastrophic was going to happen, they'd be able to, if they turned it on very slowly, they'd be able to turn it off. And it did work, and henceforth all of the 47s and then the B-52s and the B-36s all had automatic equipment that helped stabilize them. And of course today there are actually airplanes that are flying and for the Air Force where there is not even a cable that goes from the control column back to the control surfaces. It's all done automatically by wire. But that was furthest from our thought back in those days. Well, when this project, the so-called tracking control project, did lead us into quite a number of interesting problems. Another one was on the B-36, which is probably the largest plane the Air Force ever built. It was a mammoth thing. It had six propellers, and it also had, as I remember it had 4 jet engines on it, so it actually had 10 engines. It was so large that to go from one end to the other, you had a tube that you got on, and you'd lie on your back, and the thing traveled on a track from one end of the plane to the other, and it sort of be shot from one end to the other. And the concern with that plane was that it was so big that it was a question of where you'd put the instruments, because the front end of the plane wasn't necessarily wiggling the same as the rear end of the plane. And so we got into that problem in connection with our project of how do you take into account the fact that these airplanes are big and floppy and not just absolutely rigid like a fighter airplane. Anyway, out of sort of that experience, and we duly submitted all of our information and wrote our reports, and that was sort of the end of that project. I was asked if I would become what was called the systems engineer on the Meteor project at MIT. The Meteor project was started by the Navy, the Bureau of Ordnance, right after World War II, to see what could be done educationally primarily at places like MIT and Johns Hopkins and so on, to introduce missile experience into the aeronautical and electrical curricula, and to be based on the experience of Germany, where they had the V1s and the V2s, and we really didn't have anything that was quite equivalent to that in our country. And it was hoped that there would be research that would go along with the academic work that would actually move the engineering and the science ahead. The program had started at MIT in about 6 or 7 different departments. Guy Stever was very actively involved in it at the start, and there was a program that in electrical engineering, for example, and in physics. Jerry Wiesner was involved in some new kinds of radar. But as time went on, the Navy seemed to become less interested in sort of the work in different disciplinary areas. They said, in effect, where's the missile? You know, not where's the beef, but then it was, where's the missile?
Yeah.
And
well, this was at such an early stage in the development of missiles.
And really, when MIT got into it, they really hadn't expected that they're going to have to deliver a missile. But by the time that I was asked to join it, they definitely indicated they wanted a missile, and they wanted MIT to come up with sort of the concept and the technology, and the Bell Aircraft Company would build a missile. And so I ended up learning a great deal, frankly, about organization. I found that to get 7 different departments at MIT with a lot of faculty involved, all working together on a single project was a little more than I'd ever encountered before.
Yeah, well, that's a fabulous. Sometimes getting 2 departments to work together is a tremendous task.
Right. And the method that seemed to be necessary was to have a central group that would, in addition to the departmental efforts, a central engineering group that would have overall responsibility. But it was an agonizing problem, I found, to get the space, the location, to get everybody's agreement that the money would be spent on the central group and not distributed around to all the departments. And as I say, it was an exercise that I found very helpful in years that were to follow at places like NASA and the Air Force, where the problems were very similar, only of course on a much larger scale. We didn't proceed, I guess, quite rapidly enough, because after we actually did build a developmental missile, we did get it out at Point Mugu on the west coast. It was slung underneath an so-called F-3D aircraft. We trained the pilots to fly it, and we're going to go out onto the range and try shooting at a drone target. The technology had gone beyond just towing sleeves, and you actually had remotely controlled drones that you could fire at. But there was great impatience in Washington. We weren't moving more rapidly and so on. And I can remember one day when I got a call from a person named Bob Briggs, who was in charge of the project out there. And he said, "It's gone." And I said, "What do you mean it's gone?" And he said, "I mean the missile's gone." I said, "Well, it can't be." And he said, "Well, it is." He said, "We were flying around in this course, which is like a race course where you went around and the target would be out over the ocean. And as the airplane, the F-3D, came around the corner, it would go out after the drone and then fire the missile." That was the idea. But in going around the corner, when neither the pilot nor our engineer, who was on the right-hand side, were looking, the missile dropped off the airplane. And this was, one of life's darkest moments. Oh. And I said, "Well, do you know approximately when it came off?" And they said, "Well, they knew approximately." And they were just going out with the Navy to see if they could find it. And I said, "Well, what kind of terrain is down there?" And they said, "Well, it's farmland." And actually, it turned out to be a very large bean field, you see. And lo and behold, they actually did find the spot where the missile had hit the ground, and it had gone underground about 15 feet into this bean field. And they had to get out there and dig a great big hole. And of course, everybody in the vicinity was terribly interested, and they had to cordon it off and pull this thing out and took it back to our laboratory.
Yeah, that's amazing that they were able to find it almost like a needle in a haystack thing.
Yeah, and so then of course they had to say something to the public at large, and they wrote this story, a heroic story about the Marine pilot in the airplane realized he had to jettison this missile, but he didn't want to endanger anybody's life, so he carefully selected this bean field where he could drop it.
Fine. It's good. Very good public relations.
That's right. And well, we did have one more missile, and were able to fire it, and it worked well enough that we got some good information, but it was decided to discontinue the project.
What year was that?
Well, this is in 1950. It's in the summer of 1953.
Oh yes.
So when it was discontinued, there was a question of what would happen to this group that I had accumulated as the sort of the system engineering group, and it was converted over into what was called the Flight Control Laboratory, and I became its director. And we ended up with a number of projects. One of them was a hydrofoil boat that Gibbs and Cox was working on, and they didn't know how to control it to keep it so it would be stable when it went up on the foils. So we were able to salvage some of the equipment from our Meteor project and put it on the ship, and we had a very interesting time over a 2-year period. And we reached the point where you could fly this hydrofoil boat just like an airplane, make bank turns with it, and so on. We had a variety of other projects, but it came a time when I got a call from RCA, and they said that they were interested in having me consider coming to and working for them in a systems laboratory that they were going to start in Camden, New Jersey, and would I come down and visit them there? Well, I went down to Camden, New Jersey, and wasn't enchanted with the environment there, and advised them that no, really, I wasn't interested in leaving Cambridge. And actually, there was a family reason for not leaving as well. Namely, we have one son who's very hard of hearing, and he was doing very well with a special educational program, and we felt if we moved to New Jersey or Washington or what have you, that it would be very difficult for him. So I advised them anyway that I wouldn't accept, and about a week later they said, well, would you be willing to start a laboratory for RCA in the Boston area? Well, that was very, very interesting and challenging.
Yes, and I would say very, very complimentary. There are several instances in history where corporations have moved institutions to suit the needs essentially of the chief investigator, and so you join a very elite group there.
Now, it turned out that MIT at that time was getting quite concerned that the tail might be wagging the dog and that there was too much research going on for the amount of education. And I knew Dr. Killian and Stratton, Jay Stratton and so on, had this concern. And so it seemed as though maybe making the move and possibly being able to hire some of the people in the Flight Control Laboratory would work out well, and that is what happened. The Flight Control Lab came to an end. Maybe 50% of the people who worked in it, because each individual was a free choice, and that's how we were able to get off to a pretty fast start in the old Waltham Watch building out near Route 128.
Oh, yeah.
And I was introduced then to another kind of organization, namely a large corporation with quite a few levels of organization who would tend to move in and have ideas on how we can improve our operations.
Yeah. That must have been some of the early days of Route 128, founding of Route 128.
Well, after there was some wonderful people at RCA. Elmer Engstrom was one.
Oh, yes.
And he was at the corporate level, and he was a tremendous help when certain problems came along. One of them was that after a while, the Waltham Watch building was seen not to be the ultimate answer. Other people had moved into other parts of it, and it was sort of a dreary building, to put it mildly. And RCA they decided that it was going to be advantageous to have a sort of an engineering laboratory there in the Boston area. We were able to collect some very good people and so on. And so they decided that that it would become more permanent, which meant finding some land and putting up a building. And we made a map of where everybody lived. And at that time I was living down in Beverly, and of course I'd like to have had the lab in Beverly, but I knew I'd lose about 50% of the people if we moved it that far. But I edged it as far as possible in the direction of Beverly along 128, which turned out to be Burlington, Mass, where there were very, very few laboratories and very, very few manufacturing operations at that time. If you go there now, you'll find clustered around where RCA finally put their building, maybe 40 or 50 other companies that are located in that area. It's kind of amazing.
Fantastic growth there.
Yeah. But anyway, the question was, what kind of a building would we have? And I wanted a multi-storied building and so on. And they said, no. They said, we're not really sure you're going to succeed. So we want to have it a one-story building. And the clearance throughout, if we decide that you're not going to succeed, we want to be able to convert it to a warehouse. So there has to be, I think it was 12-foot clearance throughout in the event that we have to go back and have to give up the lab and go to a warehouse. And I said, well, okay, I'll go with that, but let's make it then in the shape of an H so that you don't have to walk too far to get from one part of the building to another. And they said that would be fine. And when I went to look at the design, this was at corporate headquarters in New York, I found that the building was absolutely square and had no windows. And I said, well, we agreed it was going to be H-shaped. And they said, well, it really is, but we just took the ends and folded them in. And so it turned out to be a square. And that's when I went to Elmer Engstrom and I said, look, there's no way I can hire, good, competent technical people to work in a blockhouse with no windows. And he stepped in at the corporate level, and he was, senior executive vice president. So we got the building we wanted. One of the projects that we became involved in had to do with space. RCA started in let's see, it was in 55, and in 57 Gagarin went into orbit, and soon after that NASA was formed. And there was a lot of concern in the Department of Defense about satellites going overhead, and the thought that we should at the very least be able to go up and inspect what was there, and possibly even to intercept. And right out of the Secretary of Defense's office, we obtained a project, SD-10 as I remember it, Secretary of Defense 10, and it was called the SAINT project, Satellite Interceptor. And that was the first time that I'd really had to concern myself with orbital parameters and so on. But it really was the same technology that we'd started off on back in the days of fighter airplanes and then missiles, and now the satellites, maneuvers and so on, really weren't that different, mathematically speaking. And even some of the technology was very similar. The only difference was, of course, the largest difference was when you got up into space, you didn't have control surfaces. You had to have little jets to drive you where you wanted to go.
Yeah, the driving mechanism and the control mechanism quite different.
But you still had the problem of orienting the vehicle the right way so that when you fired the jets, you'd go in the direction you wanted. Well, I'd known Cortlandt Perkins for quite a period of time. He and I first were sort of shoulder to shoulder when we were working on our master's theses back in the basement of Building 33 at MIT. I like to point out it was right where they took all the trash out into the street every night. That's where we were located. And by this time, this is now 1959. He was Assistant Secretary of the Air Force. And at that time, there was a laboratory in Holland that was set up to do electronic research for NATO. It was a laboratory that was right near The Hague, and there'd always been a U.S. director. The director who was there was about to retire, and he asked me if I'd be interested in going over there and being the director. So after chatting with him about it and finding out about it, I went home and talked to my wife, Jean, and we figured that by then our son, Toby, was far enough along that he was actually at a boarding school, and that probably doing something quite different was in order. It would be sort of interesting to be over there in Holland for 3 years, and the work appeared to be in line with the kind of thing I had been doing, and I felt I could handle it. And so we agreed we'd do it. Well, at just about the time that my name was going to be submitted, the U-2 was shot down over the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev came to this country, and this is the time when he was pounding the podium at the UN with his shoe and so on.
Very historic moment.
Yes. And some of the NATO countries were sort of appalled that the United States, sort of on its own, without telling them, had decided to put up the U-2 and go over and get those pictures and so on. And they decided that maybe it was time that instead of having a U.S. director of one of their laboratories, it might be a good idea to have a European.
Oh, yes.
And so anyway, I did not get the job.
So the U-2 incident changed your career somewhat then.
Now, maybe they're just being polite, to me, and maybe there are other reasons why I didn't get it. Mm-hmm. But I was sitting in my office in June, this is now the June of 1960, when I got a call from Keith Glennon, who was the administrator of NASA. And I'd never met him, but of course I'd followed NASA, and I was very interested in what was going on in the space area. And as I mentioned earlier, we had one project at RCA, and I guess I should have also mentioned that I'd been on the NACA Committee for Stability and Control ever since 1948. And it had been one of those that argued strenuously that you didn't have to stabilize airplanes just by using the air particles going by the outside, that you could do something internal of the airplane that would be helpful. And then when NASA was formed, they set up some special advisory committees ad hoc to advise the new organization, as NACA was transformed into NASA, what might be done in the space area, in the controls and so on. So I knew some of the people in NASA at that time, including Hugh Dryden, whom I respected very much. And so anyway, I got the call from Keith Glennon, and he said, Dr. Seamans, Keith Glennon, and I just wondered if you're going to be down here in Washington anytime soon. And I gave him a truthful answer. I started by saying, no, I wasn't planning to, but I was about to say, but I'd be happy to come down if you want to see me. Yeah. When he was a very direct person, and you probably knew him actually.
Oh yes, I
because of the AEC and so on.
I knew him as a commissioner back when I was 52 to end. I think actually.
He went to Yale, and so I always kidded him that he reminded me slightly of an old bulldog. But anyway, he said, "Will you have dinner with me tonight at the Statler?" And I said, "Of course." And so I arrived at the Statler, and we went in and had an old-fashioned and ordered dinner, and then he just pulled out an organization chart right out of his pocket, and without further ado, he said, I've discussed this with Hugh Dryden, and we want you to come down and be the associate administrator of NASA. He said, you probably don't know what that means, so here's this chart, and your job is right there. And he put his thumb right down on the chart. And he said, this is the job that Dick Horner now has. And Dick is leaving, and but he agreed to take the job for 1 year, but now he wants to go back into private life and would like you to come down and be what we might call a general manager of NASA. So we discussed it, and of course I chewed it over with a lot of adrenaline pumping all the way home and discussed it with Gene, and we finally decided that would be a pretty darn exciting thing to do. So almost before I knew it, I was down there on September 1st being sworn in by Keith as the associate administrator. And then came, of course, the process, thanks to Keith, of spending a whole month going around and visiting each one of the laboratories, which included not only the old NACA labs and centers, but also Werner von Braun's Huntsville operation and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and the Goddard Lab, which grew out of the Naval Research Lab. And sometime after that, I guess it was probably in October, we had a retreat down in Williamsburg with about 70 of the senior NASA people. He said, I think it would be good if you just stood up and for about a half an hour, you give everybody at this retreat, we'll call it the impressions of a new associate administrator. So, I really agonized over this. What's important? What have I seen in these 5 or 6 weeks that might be significant and might be helpful? But just for fun to begin with, I said, one of the things that's really struck me about NASA is its formality. I said, you all know I used to be at RCA, and there we made a fetish of calling people by first name or nicknames. I said, there was a senior vice president, we called him Pinky. And I said, it's hard for me to do it, but I finally did. But now I find down here, we're doctor this and doctor that and Mr. this. And I made it clear that I sort of preferred first names. And well, afterwards, nobody paid any attention to anything else I said. There was a cocktail party, and Eberhard Rees came up to me. And he'd worked with Werner von Braun at Peenemünde. And he was the man that really made things work, the V2 and everything. And Werner was a consummate salesman. That's really a good salesman. He was a good technical person, too. But Eberhard came up and he said, Bob, he said, I want you to know that just last week, Werner said I could call him Werner. I said, I can't believe it, Eberhard. You mean you've been working with him for 20 years and you've been calling him Dr. von Braun? He said, oh no, Herr Dr. von Braun.
That's the ultimate in German formality,
yeah,
all right?
Yeah. So, of course, it wasn't too long after that there was an election, and you had a new president coming in by the name of John F. Kennedy. And I wasn't at all sure whether in the next administration I'd be around or not. But during the interregnum between the election and the swearing in, there was quite a bit of time to sort of review where we were going in NASA. I had gone to an Eisenhower cabinet meeting when Keith described the space program plans, and when George Kistiakowsky had described a.
All right, fine. Well, you were right in the middle of discussing some of the vital decisions of confronting NASA at that time. So let us proceed from there.
All right. I mentioned that Jim Webb was named the administrator, and it was a remarkably fortuitous choice, I might say. And he agreed to come on the basis that Dr. Dryden stay as a deputy. But there was no decision, I realized, as to who was going to be the associate administrator. So I was asked into his room and into his office, and he asked me a lot of questions that had very little to do with the space program. There were such questions as, what did I think of the organization of Sears Roebuck, the way they did their business? Fortunately, when I was at RCA, I'd taken a management course and knew a little bit about the subject. and so I could compare them with the organization of Montgomery Ward. And after about an hour of this kind of discussion, he said, well, perhaps we ought to go out and get a little lunch. And he said, well, where would you like to go for lunch? And I said, well, Mr. Webb, you know Washington better than I do. Why don't you make the selection? And he said, how about the National Democratic Club? And I said, I don't know. Do they I think I'd better face up to the issue. Do they accept Republicans in there for lunch? And during the lunch, he seemed to be sort of aware of this and a little bit concerned about it. He said, this isn't too bad a lunch, you think? And I said, no, it's really not too bad. But after that, I found he was very pleased with the fact that we had a bipartisan organization. And when I would appear on a podium with him, he always made a point of, I'm a Democrat, and Bob Seamans, here's the Republican. Oh, yeah. But the question, we were late getting at it because I think 5 or 6 weeks had gone by into the Kennedy administration, and we were late at reviewing our budget, which is the custom after when the president comes in to review the budget of the previous administration. And so we had our meeting with Dave Bell, who was the director of the budget, now OMB, and we went in and essentially recommended what we'd recommended to Eisenhower, that we should proceed with the Saturn vehicle and with the Apollo project. And Dave Bell said, well, I'm sure that the president's not ready for any such decision as this. He said, this is something that's going to take a lot of time to think over, and we'll consider this in connection with next year's budget. But we insisted that this be considered at least by the president, and so we had a meeting with him. And there was Hugh Dryden, Mr. Webb, and myself. Glenn Seaborg was there as well, because it was a question of the nuclear rocket. Yes. And I remember Jerry Wiesner and Mac Bundy, and I guess the vice president was there, and the president. We had what I thought was a very good discussion of the pros and cons. President Kennedy and I were classmates at Harvard, although I didn't know him very well. And it was duly noted that he did not recognize me at the meeting. But in any event, he did elect to put in some additional funds for a launch vehicle. He was no way ready to accept the Apollo program, which would have been the next step beyond Mercury and might have then led to circumlunar or even a lunar landing. But it wasn't very long after that a gentleman named Gagarin went into orbit. And at that point, President Kennedy became very much aware of some of the pitfalls of having the Soviet Union do these things unexpectedly and then having to explain later why they were so, quote, far ahead of us. And so he turned to the vice president, who was by then had formally made the chairman of the Space Council, and said, what do we do? And the vice president had a way of trying to gather people together to get a consensus, but at least in this case, it didn't lead to any solution. So finally, in desperation, I guess, he turned to Bob McNamara and Jim Webb and said, look, you two people, McNamara as Secretary of Defense and Jim Webb as head of NASA, must have the best information available as to what we can and can't do and what might really make sense. And he said, I want your report in 10 days. It turned out that the meeting to discuss this matter occurred on a Saturday morning, the day after Shepard went into suborbital flight. There was a big question whether to let Alan fly or not. There was great concern in the White House that if he failed on something that was not even as much as what Gagarin had done, we would really look sick in the eyes of the world and incompetent and so on. But finally, we made the argument, but supposing he's successful, don't you think that might be quite positive? And it was agreed that, yes, he would be allowed to go, and it was successful. And even by Saturday morning, we knew that it had a tremendous effect in Europe, that people had watched it on television and felt they were sort of part of it. And so the first discussion had to do with whether to have an open program or not, whether to continue an open program. And it was agreed that, yes, it had to be an open program. And it would also then meant that we had to name our goal, and the Russians would know it, but they didn't have to reveal what they were doing. And so we were playing a game of poker, but our cards were down on the table. And our recommendation was that we ought to go for the lunar landing. That we did stand a reasonable chance of getting there before the Soviet Union could get there, because a great deal remained to be done, that they did not have in hand all of the boosters and equipment that would be required. Bob McNamara was skeptical. He said he wasn't sure about what they couldn't do it already, and possibly the goal that should be named would be taking men to the planets. And I was horror-stricken at that thought, because that was going to be...
order of magnitude more difficult.
That's about a year's flight. We weren't sure that human beings could stand it, what being weightless, and all of the... We didn't know much about the planets.
Or the physiology of individuals.
Exactly, as well as the psychology of... And so anyway, the decision was made that yes, we would recommend that be the goal. There were a lot of other detailed recommendations that were made that had to do with defense, as well as some of the NASA unmanned programs. Worked all weekend writing the report. Jim Webb came over at midnight Sunday night after having worked all day on the plans for Alan Shepard's triumphal return to Washington and addressing the Congress. Read the whole thing over that I'd been working on with John Rubel. And the next morning, it was signed by McNamara and Jim Webb and was transmitted to the Vice President. And at the luncheon at the State Department that was hosted by the Vice President, he actually had in a manila envelope this report, which he then took over to the President and then left for Southeast Asia, his first trip to Southeast Asia. Sort of a historic moment in many ways. And of course then began the job of putting it all together. And were we going to hire a lot more people in NASA, or are we going to use contractors? And do we need some more additional centers? And where would the centers be located? And how are we going to work with the Air Force? And could we get the Corps of Engineers, as we did, to put up all the new structures that would be required? And there were a very large number of decisions that had to be made. I guess the most interesting one, certainly from a technical standpoint, was what mode of operation to use. The commonly accepted mode was build a great big pile of rocket stages and so on, and put all the vehicles for the human beings up on the nose and go to the moon, and when you get out, you've still got enough there that you can shoot back at the Earth, and you've got the right re-entry capsule to come into the atmosphere.
Yes, so that was a very interesting problem at the time, as I remember. I'm very interested to see what your story is as to how you arrived at the decision the way it went. That was very much of a controversial thing.
It was very controversial, and this method, this called direct ascent method, was what the German people naturally expected to do. This is what Werner and his people were prepared to build all those great big rockets. Now, another possible approach, which was considered very seriously at the start, was to use a somewhat smaller booster to put a lot of elements in orbit around the Earth and bring them all together and sort of reassemble in Earth orbit what would be required to then do exactly the same thing, to leave Earth orbit, go to the moon, and have enough on the surface of the moon that you could come back directly to the Earth. And so these two approaches, the direct ascent and the Earth orbit rendezvous, were the two avenues that were followed almost exclusively for the first year. For example, the land acquisition down at the Cape, we finally decided after examining 5 possible sites, including Pacific sites as well as Atlantic sites to enlarge the operation at the Cape and make use of all that the Air Force had there already. But we acquired Merritt Island, we acquired 87,000 acres of land on Merritt Island, which was then primarily orange groves, so that we could not only build the Saturn booster, which would be required for the Earth orbit rendezvous, but build something called Nova, which was at least twice as large. That will be up in the northern part of Merritt Island. And parenthetically, it should be noted that this is what the Russians chose to do, to build a very large vehicle, but they never were successful in launching it. They tried twice, and both times it exploded either on the pad or at a very low altitude. But anyway, during my first month in NASA, in touring around the different centers, I had met somebody named John Hubalt, and he was a young engineering scientist at the Langley Field who had a team of 5 people, and they were examining various ways of going to the moon and returning. And they'd come up with a scheme where you would go directly to orbit around the moon, but then you'd break off a vehicle that would go and land on the moon, leaving all of the heavy Earth reentry equipment in orbit around the moon. And then when you took off, you'd rendezvous and dock with it in lunar orbit, and then use the heavy equipment to come back. And this meant that you didn't have to decelerate and then accelerate again this very high mass capsule. And what you're talking about on the moon is roughly 4,000 feet per second of first deceleration and then acceleration, which takes a lot of fuel. And he felt that this would be a much more economical way, from an energy standpoint, of going to the moon. Well, after we were all established and we had Brainerd Holmes had left RCA to come down and head up this project, and he had Werner von Braun and Bob Gilruth and Kurt Debus and all these people charging ahead, contractors like North American and the Bell Telephone Labs, and everybody roaring down on these 2 approaches of direct ascent or Earth orbit rendezvous. I started getting letters from John Hubalt. And he said, as the general manager of NASA, I would think you'd be deeply concerned about the approaches that are being followed. Don't you feel that you have some responsibility to enter into the decision as to which way to be going? And these letters were quite abrasive letters. And I'd read this letter, and here's this young guy down there at Langley Field, and I think, well, should I tear it up and just throw it away and forget about it, or should I call Bob Gilruth on the phone, who's the director of the lab, and tell him to get this guy off my back? He's a pain in the neck. But then I did remember the discussion, and also from the experience I'd had back in RCA with the so-called satellite interceptor, realized that intercept problem is not really very difficult. And that's what everybody was concerned about. If you fail to rendezvous and dock in lunar orbit, I mean, you have bought the farm. You're not coming back home. And you can imagine how catastrophic that would be to astronaut families and world opinion and the whole bit, leaving these poor guys to eventually run out of oxygen and orbit around the moon for the rest of eternity. So what I actually did do each time, when I got a series of letters, I can't tell you exactly how many, but 3 or 4, I'd call Brainerd Holmes on the phone, I'd tell him about this idea, or perhaps I even went over and had lunch with him. But anyway, I'd give him the letter and say, I really wish you'd consider this possibility, because it does have some attractive features. And after about 6 months, well, to begin with, he kept saying, well, it's an interesting idea, but we're going in another direction. But about 6 months later, one day I was having lunch with him alone and discussing the Apollo program. He said, quite a few of our group are beginning to think that's the way to go. He said, it has another very attractive feature. that you can design the vehicle to go down to the lunar surface and come back into orbit just for that purpose. It can be very, very different from anything you could possibly use in the atmosphere. It can have long arms and be very flexible. It can have a large window in it so that you can look down and see the lunar surface as you come in. We can make it so it is very, very flexible in its operation just for working around the moon. So as soon as it appeared that that might be the way to go, I advised Hugh Dryden and Jim Webb that this was beginning to be quite an attractive idea. I met with them very frequently anyway and tried to keep them up to date. But they could see some of the pitfalls in doing this, that everybody expected us to do something different. A big change like that is bound to come under all kinds of scrutiny by Congress and the White House and so on, and sure enough it did. And Jerry Wiesner had several people working for him, Jerry Wiesner being Kennedy's science advisor.
Oh, yes, I remember.
At that time. One of them being a person named Nick Golovin, who had worked for NASA for a few years, had not been highly regarded because he believed very strenuously in making reliability calculations where you took into account every single part in the rocket, for example, and then you figure out what's the likelihood each part will work, and then you sum it all up depending on how it's all interconnected, and you say, gosh, we've only got a 10% chance of this thing succeeding. Well, he proceeded to run an analysis like this on our lunar orbit rendezvous, and he felt that the chances of losing astronauts was going to be much too high. And we ended up with some very difficult I call them negotiations, really. And the most exciting one was when we were showing the president and the vice president what we were doing first at Huntsville and then at the Cape and then down at Houston. And we were right in the middle of the large assembly area at Huntsville with the president, the vice president, Bob McNamara, I think Thornycroft, Minister of Defense from Great Britain, Jerry Wiesner, and a couple of other people, when President Kennedy turned to Jim Webb and said, I understand you and Jerry don't quite see eye to eye on how we're going to the moon. And we were in a central part of this great big area, and around the outside were all the employees of Huntsville and all the correspondency. And all of a sudden we're right there, right in the goldfish bowl, arguing about this whole matter, which is what Kennedy enjoyed doing. And so we had it out right there, but no decision was reached. But Kennedy said, I want to be kept fully informed of this. And we could not reach an accommodation with Jerry's people and so on. And it was finally the day, and I wasn't there for this one, but this is what I understand happened, when Jim went over to see the president and said, Mr. President, you have to decide, do you want me to run the project or do you want to have your science advisor? And so it was decided that we would go lunar orbit rendezvous, which proved to be successful. Now, when I went back,
and essentially afterwards, now it's very obvious it was the right way to go, but it wasn't at that time.
Yeah. So that was a very instructive series of negotiations, studies first. It sort of bore out the fact that you get to keep your antenna open for ideas as you proceed, that you've got to use some of your own gut feeling or experience, if you want to call it that, and you got to lean a little bit now and then to get the machinery to go in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, this is a very, very interesting story, as I remember the controversy, of course, in this, but I didn't know about the origin of the idea, and I'm very delighted you were able to bring out the circumstances there. It's a very interesting part of the history.
Well, John Hubalt deserves a lot of credit. He really does. Abrasive as he was, he happened to be right. And perhaps I've overemphasized the abrasiveness, but he was insistent. That's no question about that.
And dedicated.
Yeah. Well, perhaps to wrap up NASA, there was a very tough time that we had. It started on an afternoon when a large number of people were over at a signing ceremony at the White House, having to do with space. This was a protocol that was signed by both the Russians and ourselves, and Jim Webb used it as an occasion to bring in some of our contractors and give them the opportunity to be at the White House for this occasion, to meet with the president. Johnson was then the president. By then, I was the deputy administrator. Dryden had passed away in the interim. And there was going to be a dinner that night for the contractors, but I was having some people at our house, including Dr. Draper and so on. So I went home, and I walked in the door, and the phone was ringing, and it was George Lowe on the phone from Houston, and he said, "They're gone." And I said, "What do you mean they're gone?" And he said, "Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee are dead." And we were running a test on Apollo down at the Cape, and we had a fire in the capsule. And
I remember that devastating.
And that was a devastating event for a great number of people in NASA, and it turned out to be quite devastating on a national basis because people identified with these astronauts and felt that they almost knew them personally, and there were all kinds of investigations and so on. And what we did that night, of course, was first to inform everybody, the president. I was talking to the vice president. I went directly to my office so I could make the calls, and Gene wasn't to tell the guests coming to our house what I was doing. And so they didn't know till the evening was over, and started making phone calls. And one of them, I was talking, I guess I wasn't talking to the vice president, I was talking to McNamara about it. His office called to see if the news was true, and I said that it was. And just as I was talking to him, the operator cut in and she said, there's an emergency call. And so I talked to the emergency. It was Peter Hackus of NBC telling me I had to come right over to the NBC studio to explain to the country what was going on. And I don't think I've ever been more upset at anybody than I was at Peter Hackus for feeling that was where my responsibilities lay.
Yes, some of these media people feel that they're the ones who are running.
Because that was the last thing in the world I wanted to do.
Yeah.
But we arranged that night that we would have a review board. Dr. Tommy Thompson of Langley would head it. He was very highly respected. The next morning at crack of dawn, I got in a NASA plane, picked him up, went down to the Cape, and established the review board. We'd impounded all of the equipment and everything already. And before they were through, we had a team of about 5,000 people investigating what had happened. Fire experts, and we brought in people from the Air Force who had this kind of experience, people from the Office of Mines and so on, from the Department of Interior. But the problem was, one of the problems was that of keeping an umbrella over the investigation so that they could come up, but without having to sort of explain what they were doing each day with their findings and recommendations. At the same time, we had to keep the President and the Congress and the media informed to some extent of what was going on. And the way that was done was for me to go down once a week to the Cape, review with this team that we put together where they stood, and then on the way back in the airplane, I'd write a report, which I'd then submit to Jim Webb. He would then take it over to the President, and he'd take it up to the committees of Congress, and then it would be released. And but these are my ideas, and it still left the committee or the review board free to their own recommendations. But that was a pretty tense period of time.
Oh yeah, so that that must have been a terrible period to live through.
And there were a lot of very sad personal situations that grew out of it, not the least, of course, the families of the astronauts. And when we got through all that, that occurred as I remember it, in February, and by the following summer, end of the summer, we had things pretty well back on course. We had to completely redesign the capsule, leaving out all cloth, for example. Everybody asked the question, what went wrong? How did this possibly happen? And there isn't any very good answer to that, except that we tried to test everything. The rocket motors on the stand, we'd shake everything, we'd expose everything to the shock of takeoff. The one thing we never did was to actually start a fire in a capsule with 100% oxygen. We tested all the equipment that went in for fire. We took all the cloth we used and we'd light it in a vacuum and see how, or light it in 100% oxygen, see how it burned. But we had never, in an enclosed capsule with 100% oxygen at 14.7 psi, struck a match. And we realized that was a deficiency in our test program, and we did do that afterwards, and we found there was absolutely no way you could extinguish a fire once it started.
Yes, I had an experience in my administration at Oak Ridge where we had a chamber that had oxygen, and we almost had a similar thing. Fortunately, not fatal. It's a very devastating and unusual, unexpected.
The reason we did it was that we did not want to have a two-gas system. It would be much simpler just to have pure oxygen. And as soon as we were in space, we'd bleed off the oxygen, get it down to the equivalent of a partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere, and it was all that an individual needs. They don't need the nitrogen in the air. And what the solution was really very simple. The solution was that we'd start off with atmospheric pressure and the normal air, if you will, but we would not recirculate the nitrogen. There was enough leakage in the system that after about an hour, you'd have nothing in there but the pressure of the oxygen, around 3.5 to 4 psi. But as I say, there was a redesign. We had all new material for the astronaut suits and so on. And so about that time, this is now 7.5 years after arriving in Washington, I'd only intended to stay about 2. I submitted my resignation to Jim Webb and went back to MIT.
Yeah.
And I went back. They were nice enough to invite me back as a Hunsaker professor and in aeronautical engineering. And the only duty I had in the first year of the Hunsaker professor was to deliver one lecture, which is called the Minter-Martin Lecture.
Didn't have too much of an academic load that year, then.
Not too much. That was great fun. Jerry Hunsaker was still coming into his office. He was 84 years old, and since I was the Hunsaker professor, he felt quite free to ask me questions whenever he wanted, and he asked me some great questions. I had a lot of fun there that first year, even though in the spring, I was going up there into MIT while my family was down here. And we got a house up there, and in the fall, everything was just fine that following fall because my family and I were up there. We were in a house that we were remodeling. But along about the middle of December, I guess it was, I got a call from somebody named Mel Laird. And I never met him, but I knew who he was. He was going to be the new Secretary of Defense. He said, "Bob, by any chance are you going to be down in Washington in the next few years?" Well, this time...
Sounds like a familiar story.
Yeah. But it turns out this time I was going to be, because the next day I was going to be in Washington because I was going to fly down to see the launching of the Apollo 8 that was going to fly Frank Borman and company around the moon.
Oh, yeah.
I was going down to the Cape. And so I told him that. And he said, well, would you have lunch with me? And I said, I certainly would. And I went, he had a room in a hotel there in the middle of Washington, which in the room he had all the organization charts of the Department of Defense around on the wall. A fellow named Bill Baruti was his sort of executive officer, who'd worked with him up on the Hill. Bill was there. Mel Laird wasn't. And I found out this was one of Mel's habits. He not always absolutely on time. But when finally he came in and was very apologetic for being late. And we had right in the middle of this rather large room, a table set for two, and Bill Baruti left. And all during the meal, we talked about technical people. He asked me what I thought of people like Johnny Foster and Al Flax, people I knew well, and I did my best to indicate, to give him my own appraisal of their capabilities. And then all of a sudden he said, well, I want you to know now why I've invited you to be here. I'd like you to come down and be the Secretary of the Air Force. And I was absolutely stunned. I mean, I never even dreamed that was going to happen. I thought there might be some technical job or something he'd want me to have. So I gave him 19 reasons why that was a very poor idea. And but he explained that he wanted to have, for his 3 service secretaries, one holdover. He said he was going to ask Stan Resor to continue to be the Secretary of the Army. He wanted to have one political person. And he said that was going to be, he hoped, John Chafee, who had been the governor of Rhode Island for, I think, 4 terms. And he wanted to have one technical person, and he said he'd discussed this with a lot of people, and they'd all felt that I was up to it. Well, I didn't. He finally got me to say that I would not turn it down right there in the room, that I'd go back and discuss it. So after going down to Florida for the launching, I went back home to discuss it with Jean, my wife, who at that time was not very well. And so we ended up with some of the discussion in her hospital bedroom. I also was very concerned by then about what my children, what the reaction might be, because Vietnam was already not the most popular war that we'd ever had. And I discussed it with each one of our children individually, our 4 oldest at least, and explained it to them one by one, and every one of them said I ought to do it, which surprised me. It wasn't that they favored the war effort, it was that they prefer to see me in the job than some other people they could think of. And so anyway, it did turn out that I accepted, but I begged for some additional time, and finally I got an extra, I think, 4 weeks of time so that I could finish my work at MIT and deliver this lecture, which I actually delivered after I became Secretary of the Air Force. I called, Howard Johnson was then president of MIT, and I said, I went over to see him immediately when I got back, and Howard said, you know, Bob, he said, when the president asks you to do something, you've got to have an awfully good reason for turning it down. And so I said, well, if I accept, do you still think I need to give the Minter Martin lecture? He said, I'll be very disappointed if you don't. And he did not let me off the hook. But anyway, we were involved with the Air Force for 4 1/3 years. There were some exciting things, needless to say. One memorable event, talking about space as we have, was something called the Manned Orbital Laboratory. The Air Force was going to make use of the Gemini NASA capsule to have a laboratory in space to try out various ideas for reconnaissance and so on. And this has been a program that had been going on, but had been going on rather slowly. And one of the first things I was asked when I was sworn in was to investigate the Manned Orbital Laboratory, and I knew that there was quite a bit of talk about canceling it. Well, after looking it over, I came back with a recommendation that it ought to be accelerated. I said, if you're going to have a project like this, you only have so much time when you can have continuous support for it. On the one, and also, if you let things drag on, the total cost run, you have to carry a lot of extra costs. And the way to do these jobs is to set the goal tight and then go and do it. And so that was my recommendation, but I kept getting this feedback from various people that probably the manned orbital lab was going to be canceled. I thought that would be really terrible to come in and be Secretary of the Air Force, and the first thing that gets canceled is a space project, and that's what my recent experience has been. So I talked to Mr. Laird about it. He allowed me to come in one day a week with an agenda of anything I wanted to discuss for about an hour with him and with Mr. Packard, Dave Packard. I bring along John McLucas, who was my deputy. And at one of these meetings, I said that I knew that this was being considered the cancellation, but I would like the privilege, before the final decision was made, of discussing it with the President. I thought it was of that importance. And so I got a call one Saturday morning and from Mel Laird, and he said, we have an appointment with the President this afternoon at 3 o'clock to discuss the manned orbital laboratory.
Yeah, it didn't give you much time for preparation.
And I had done a little bit of work ahead, and so I had a few overhead photographs and things of that sort, and so I knew, so I could talk intelligently about resolution from various altitudes and the importance of resolution and knowing what was going on around the world and looking at different armaments. So anyway, we had the meeting in the Oval Room. As we went in, I could see outside, I guess it was in the Rose Garden, sort of a band of people leaning on their instruments and the podium. And obviously some great ceremony was going to take place. It turned out some head of state was about to arrive. And the President was at his desk with a yellow pad. Kissinger was there. I took along General Stewart, who was in charge of the project, and Mr. Laird. So I started through with the charts, and the President kept writing and writing and writing, and pretty soon somebody stuck their head in the door and said, the ceremony starts in 5 minutes. And the President asked a couple of questions, and I kept talking, and finally, in effect, Mr. Laird picked me up by the scruff of the neck and led me out of the room. And on Monday, I got a call from Kissinger, who was the security advisor to the President at that time, and in his German accent, he said it was a very, very fine presentation, Bob. Very, very fine. And on Tuesday, I found it had been canceled.
Oh. Well, these are momentous decisions that come very fast.
Yeah. I might just say one thing about the technical endeavor of the Air Force. I won't take you through all of the different projects and their trials and tribulations, but I'd sort of developed a philosophy of how large projects, need to be reviewed, and it was my feeling that they have to be reviewed on a periodic basis if you're going to be able to really know what's going on. One reading of a project doesn't tell you very much. It's what happens over time that tells you what's really going on. And I found that there already was what was called the Secretary's a weapon system review, or words to that effect, over in the conference room that I fell heir to. And I said, okay, let's go through it just the way you've always done it. I'd like to just see what the process is. It was about 2 weeks after I went in the Air Force. So I go to walk in the door, and there's a colonel standing there, and he flicks his heel like this and says, and sort of salutes, and says the Secretary of the Air Force, and everybody jumps up and stands at stiff attention, and I sit down at the end of the table, and they start going through these slides very fast like this. And after about 20 minutes of this, I say, whoa, let's hold it. I'd like to know how many levels in the Air Force organization hierarchy have reviewed these charts before they came in here. And there was sort of a long pause, and people started talking, leaning over and talking to each other. And finally, General McConnell, who was then the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, said probably about 18. And I said, well, I don't think I need to spend any more time in here today, and walked out. And I said that henceforth, instead of having this review once every 3 months, we're going to have them once every month. And that the person in charge, the project manager, wherever he or she were located, were going to come in at least once every 3 months. This is the person at the colonel at right field or wherever it was. There was no point going through all these middlemen. That on the other times when these reviews were held, that somebody should be designated in headquarters who would be the liaison person. It wasn't fair to expect people to come from California once a month for this review. But this would be the person who had talked to the project person the day before and would come in with sort of an update on how things stood. And so we followed 16 projects. There are only so many projects you can follow in that detail. But I found that, for example, on cost control, the costs obviously at times run up because people don't do their job as well as they should, but oftentimes the colonel at right field, who's building the tactical airplane, will be visited by the 4-star general who's in charge of the tactical air command, who will want to review the project and find that this, that, and the other thing are not going to be included on this new airplane. Will be appalled that he's not going to have this, that, and the other thing, and will almost order this colonel, if he knows what's good for him, to insert that into the program.
Oh, yes.
And so the colonel is in a very tough spot. But by having the colonel come in, and when these kind of possibilities came up, we'd have the general in charge of the Tactical Air Command in the room, and we'd have the project person, and we'd have the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and the Deputy Chiefs of Staff, in charge of R&D, and so on, and we'd have the Assistant Secretaries, and we'd present the pros and cons and make the decision that way, rather than having it result from the colonel being leaned on with a very unfair advantage of four ranks against him. So we started in that period of time. The B-1 bomber, which has now come back to life, the F-15 fighter, a tactical fighter, the so-called A-10, the AWACS airplane was started during that period, an early warning airplane, and we got out of the woods on the F-111, which had received quite a bit of notoriety as a TFX in the previous 10 years, and we had the problems of the C-5 airplane to contend with.
You were there in a period of real controversy.
And I found there was somebody in the Air Force named Ernie Fitzgerald who was very much admired by a Senator Proxmire.
Oh, yes.
And I received letters even before I joined the Air Force about what a wonderful public servant we had, and Ernest Fitzgerald, and he was sure I'd make good use of him. And it fell my lot to fire him. And just as I was leaving the Air Force after 4 years, there was a open civil service hearing, which had never been done before, which he insisted on, with the press present, and I was not allowed to have counsel because a civil service hearing, they try to get the views of all the individuals, you see. So I was there as an individual.
Oh, yes.
And but Ernie had his lawyers, and as a result of that hearing, he was reinstated, and he got all his back pay, and he ended up suing me and several others for $3 million, and the case was only resolved in my favor, I think, about a year and a half ago.
I'll be darned. That's an amazing story there.
Yeah.
How one individual can stir up so much controversy.
But I got myself in a book called that he wrote during this period when he wasn't working for the Air Force. It was called The High Priests of Waste.
Oh, yes.
And I'm the star villain.
Oh, yes. Well, on so many of these things, accomplishment is almost forgotten to review trivialities on this thing. It's very disturbing.
Well, just about this time, let's see, Nixon was reelected, and Mel Laird had always said he would only stay for one term. Elliot Richardson came in as the Secretary of Defense. As a matter of fact, I got my first call from him when I was in Anchorage, about to leave for Antarctica with Guy Stever. And I thought, gosh, you're going to call me back to the United States. But no, I explained what I was going to do. And he said, no, you better take the trip, but see me as soon as you get back. This was in December. So we flew down to Christchurch and went down to Antarctica, which was a very, very interesting trip. It was the most interesting trip I've ever had in my life. We went down with the Russians at Vostok and down to the South Pole and put a few rivets in the new shelter down there and so on. But then when I got back and talked to Elliot, I was very impressed with the way he was taking over that responsibility. I explained to him that I really wanted to get out of the Air Force. I'd been there for 4 years, and I thought that was long enough. The average time is a year and 1.8 years for a Secretary of the Air Force. By the time I got out, I was there longer than anybody excepting Gene Zuckert.
Oh, yeah.
Who was there for 5 years.
I saw Gene the other day.
Did you really? But the last week that I was there, things were starting to come unravel a little bit with Ehrlichman and Halderman and all those kind of things. And we had morning sessions. Every Monday morning there was the Secretary's, what was it called, conference. And at 9:30 in the morning, and the Joint Chiefs and the Service Secretaries sat around the table with the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary, and then around the outside of the room were all the Assistant Secretaries of Defense. And there was sort of a normal routine we went through with different people reviewing different things that were going on. But this time, Elliot started off and he said, I have something to report to you. And I'm discussing it with you with a heavy heart. He said, I was at Camp David last night, and the President has asked me to be the Attorney General. And he said, so I'll be leaving here at the end of this week. And so actually at the time I left, he was already being consumed with the problems he was going to really get into as Attorney General. Schlesinger had not yet been named as the new Secretary of Defense. And so I ended up leaving the Pentagon. I'd written a letter and so on, but I'd never gotten any response. So I went over to become the president of the Academy of Engineering, and the first thing I did was to issue a news release saying, in effect, Bob Seamans is no longer at the Pentagon. He's over here at the Academy.
Fine. Well, at that particular point, should we just pause for a moment?
Sure.
Fine.